Thanks, Said. So maybe we can start with a quick round of introduction. So please correct me if I'm wrong
Sure.
for each one of you. So first of all, again, thank you so much, Dr. Newberg, for accepting our invitation and coming here. I really appreciate it. I'm Muhammad Amin Sarai. I'm a PhD student in University of Connecticut, and I'm basically interested in cognitive science of religion. So what I try to do is to understand how religion affects our physiological states and sometimes our social interactions.
Great.
I think you do not need that lots of introduction, since I think everyone knows you in our audience. So you're one of the renowned figures in the exploring the relationship between spirituality and brain science. You previously, so you still are a professor in Jefferson University, or you do not?
You could still say I'm there. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay, nice. So you published many books and many articles, one of which was the varieties of spiritual experiences, which definitely was a serious, I think, game-changing books. And
I try. I hope they all are.
You did. And Sa'id, Dr. Sa'id Gurmarodi, he's a professor, a visitor assistant professor in University of Wesleyan. And he teaches psychology of religion, and he's very passionate about it. We saw many talks from him, and he tries to explore this even more. So please, again, add anything you think I did not mention here. Thanks. All right.
That's all a good start. Sure.
Okay, thanks. So let's begin with our questions. So the first question I have is about the state of art in neurotheology. So I remember, I think we worked our article together maybe around 6 years ago. Wow.
Right, I know. Yeah.
And back then, I remember in Iran, when I wanted to do that, really there were not many people who knew such a field exists, and I did not have a good mentor to guide me how to go through it. And thankfully, you helped me a lot back then, and really shaped my way through my research in the future. So now many years are passed from those days, and so definitely neurotheology got a lot more recognition. So what do you think are the current gaps in this field, or how do you envision its future?
Sure. Well, I mean, as much as we have done, I always like to say that I think we're just kind of scratching the surface so far. Even if you look at all of the brain scan studies, for example, that I've been involved in, it's probably, on one hand, it sounds like a lot. We've probably done, 300-400 people. We've only done 300, 300 or 400 people. So there's so much for us to learn. And even when we talk about things like brain scans or psychology, there's so many ways of going. And that's part of why I get very excited about it as a field. To me, the idea of neurotheology as a field is something that I like to feel is very expansive. And what I mean by that is that if you kind of take first of all, to me, it is looking at the relationship between the brain and our religious or spiritual selves, very simplistically stated. But the neuro and the theology side, to me, need to be defined very broadly. So the neuro side is neuroscience and neuroimaging. It's cognitive neuroscience. It is psychology. It's anthropology. It's kind of all the ways that we get at our mind, our brain. And with that in mind, it's always a bit challenging because there are fields like the psychology of religion or the cognitive neuroscience of religion. And it's not meant that each one has its own little silo. I think in many ways, there's a lot of overlap between all of them. Everything that one can talk about in the world of psychology can connect to something that's going on within our brain and vice versa. So, there's a lot for us to continue to look at. And I think that, especially when you do talk about the brain itself, or we look at a brain scan or something like that, there's so many different aspects of that as well. So just from the physiological side, there's looking at just general brain activity. There's all the neurotransmitters. There's how the brain and the body are connected through the autonomic nervous system. There's physical health, even, if one is religious or says or does prayers, how does it affect our immune system or the stress hormones or something like that? So there's so much for to think about in that context. And in the world of psychology, I mean, thinking about that kind of again in both directions. I mean, it's how does being religious or spiritual or doing those kinds of practices affect our psyche, how does it affect depression, anxiety, and so forth? But also, how does our mind and our psyche affect the way we engage our religious or spiritual beliefs? So it really is, a two-way street. And then, of course, going back to neurotheology, the theology side also has to be very expansive, because theology is really kind of analyzing a tradition and looking at a specific sacred text and what we can say about it. And we can certainly talk about how does our brain, how does our mind help us to do that. But then, as I've already kind of alluded to, there's all kinds of discussions and evaluations we can have in terms of practices, experiences, beliefs, all the different phenomena that make up spiritual or religious traditions, and the religious or spiritual beliefs and ideas that people hold. So, to me, it just kind of keeps going. It can spill over into a discussion about morality. It can get into discussions of general spiritual experiences. As you mentioned, we wrote a book on the varieties of spiritual experiences, and there's a whole continuum of those experiences, from the very basic, just walking into a mosque and the feeling one might have, to the more deeper feelings you might have during prayer, to mystical experiences or something like that. So, there's just so much for us to do, and that to me, it's a very vibrant field. It's exciting to see, more and more people getting involved in all different elements of it in different ways. So I think there's a lot for us to continue to do. And in that regard, there's really tons of gaps. I mean, there's so many things for us to have to think about. And that's what makes it a field that's open to anyone who is interested in getting involved in it, because I think there's so many different things that we can do.
I think you just did a literature review on the current state of neurotheology. That was very nice. And so I think what I get from this is that these new students who want to start exploring such fields, they have lots of options and lots of directions that they can choose between based on what they're interested in.
Yeah. And, in the immediate moment, I suppose maybe, one other way of answering your question, which I would love to see, is sort of more formal training in this as a field. That does not exist. There is not a department of neurotheology or whatever. But that being said, to your point of your last question here, is that what I typically try to encourage students who are interested in this discussion is to pick a field that they are particularly interested in or passionate in, and that has something to do with neurotheology. So it could be psychology, it could be theology, it could be philosophy, it could be neuroscience and medicine or whatever. But as long as you then kind of develop an expertise in one of those areas, then you can use that expertise to kind of attack the discussion, attack those questions from that kind of perspective. And that to me it really helps to enrich what we can learn ultimately from the whole field of neurotheology. So if you want to become a theologian and go to, a seminary, great, then you learn a lot about what theology is, and then you can look at these kinds of questions from a theological perspective. So how does the brain help us to be theological, and what does it mean, and how do we think about it from that perspective? You could become a psychologist, and okay, how does our psychological state, and again, sometimes it can become very specific kinds of questions. It might be somebody who has a very practical perspective on trying to, how do we help people deal with depression or anxiety or PTSD, and how can they potentially use religious practices like prayer to help them through those kinds of issues, all the way to very philosophical or theological questions, very esoteric kinds of questions, and everywhere in between. And so, just learning about the mind, the brain, consciousness, all of those are things that we have the potential to look at. But I typically, at least at the moment, until there's kind of more formal training in neurotheology proper, I think people need to develop an expertise in a related area that, you know, kind of like I did with neuroimaging, and then I applied the neuroimaging to this discussion.
Yep, yep. And so that was a good point. It reminded me of of the fact that some people say that this kind of study of neuroscience of religious experiences or the neurotheology, it's sometimes people argue that it's mostly in the kind of more theoretical or more it's more distant from having any application for people. But I think what I remember from your work is that you try to actually move these kind of findings into people's lives. So how do you think it can affect people's life so how it can be useful for the public, not just as just a scientific inquiry or something?
Sure. Well, I do think there's a very strong practical clinical kind of component that neurotheology can provide, because there is a lot of work that's been done in fields like psychology and looking at the relationship between religious or spiritual beliefs and practices and how that has an impact on depression, anxiety, and so forth, as we were just talking about. So that's one piece of it. And part of what I think neurotheology helps us with is to kind of not just look at that relationship, but look at the physiology of it, which can be helpful, because then, you know, for example, I mean, just to get really granular here, if you were to do a brain scan of a certain, of doing, you know, Muslim prayer, and you find that that it affects the limbic system. Okay, well, so now that tells us that it's going to have an impact on our emotions. So we can start to think about how would that prayer practice be, you know, potentially beneficial in terms of helping somebody regulate their emotions more effectively. And perhaps we might find out that you know, different kinds of prayer practices or different lengths or, you know, whatever, they might wind up being better. Or maybe there's ways of integrating prayer into a a more traditional psychotherapeutic setting. And we find out that, you know, if you not just do cognitive behavioral therapy, but if you do cognitive behavioral therapy with prayer or with meditation or something like that, maybe it's more effective for certain circumstances. So that helps us to sort of see that whole practical side. The other piece to all of this too, which I am very excited about, but, you know, also in terms of a gap, I mean, there's very, very little that's been done, at least from a brain perspective, is to think about how religion kind of takes us in positive as well as negative directions at times. And so, you know, I often think about you know, as a doctor, I you know, in my life, in my career, I've seen circumstances where, you know, you have a patient, maybe someone who has lost a child to a disease. Now, some people turn towards God and they say, I'm going to pray, I'm going to, you know, turn to my tradition. God is going to help me through this very challenging time. And it's a great source of coping for them, for example. And then you have other people who say, why would God do this to me? I reject God. You know, God is not on my side, and I'm, you know, going to go away from God. So, that to me, you know, we don't know the difference in, I mean, we know that that happens, but what's the difference in the brain of those people? What, you know, what takes one person towards a very positive perspective of religion and somebody towards a very negative perspective? And even in terms of, you know, more broadly behaviors in the world, you know, what is the difference between someone who says, as a deeply religious person, I love everyone, I'm going to help everyone, I'm going to be charitable and altruistic and compassionate for people, and another person who says, I'm very religious and I hate everyone who doesn't believe what I believe. So, you know, what are those, where are the differences? Is it the traditions? Is it the people? Is it, you know, how much dopamine there is? So, you know, there's some real opportunities, I think, to help us to understand this. And in that context, really have some very positive practical applications to help people in general, and also to help us to find more effective ways of directing people when it comes to the beliefs that they hold, that hopefully we can help them to find the ways which wind up being beneficial to them, both in terms of their own internal psyche as well as in terms of their external actions in the world.
If I may ask just one follow-up question. So that's a fascinating topic in my opinion. I was talking to Dr. Crystal Park, another scholar of psychology of religion, the other day, and she, although of course she knows the value of working on neuroscientific work on religious experience and religious belief, but she was like, she said that it doesn't make me more real. You know, when we do research on neuroscience of it, the brain substrates and the firing of neurons doesn't make it more real. So my question is that, for example, when we have an understanding of what parts of the brain are activated, does it help any more than in an addition to the research that we have on the psychological level? Let's say that people have higher levels of meaning after these experiences, that people are happier, that people have a better sense of purpose, or they cope better with the problems they have. So what does exactly neuroscientific work, like physiological and neuroscientific work, help to expand our understanding of the functionality of religion?
Well, I think there's a couple of ways of answering that. On one hand, one thing I feel very strongly about is that whatever findings we get in neurotheology or neuroimaging or whatever it is, I don't believe in any way, shape, or form does it diminish the religiousness. So if somebody is deeply religious, on one hand, it doesn't really matter what's going on in the brain. They're religious because it has meaning to them. It's important to them. They feel that from their own personal perspective of reality, that's where it is. And so for them, whether they know that something's going on in the brain or not, may not necessarily affect that piece of it. So now that being said, and in a similar context, if I do a brain scan of how much I love my wife or something like that, it might be great to know that I release dopamine when I think of my wife or something, but it doesn't make me love her more or less because of that. Those feelings are those feelings. However, that being said, then it does go back into, but there's a lot of aspects of this where I think there's kind of reciprocal evaluations and understanding. So if you could say, well, there's a release of dopamine when you pray, again, it doesn't make the prayer any more real, but it does tell us something about what is it doing and how it's affecting us. And, going back to the practical side, maybe that tells us, maybe it would be a value in people who have different disorders where dopamine's involved, like attention deficit disorder or Parkinson's disease or something along those lines. Obviously, there's the whole field of consciousness studies and where are our thoughts, where is our consciousness? And so can it help us to understand that piece of things more? And then also going back to, what I just mentioned, does it help us to even understand, could it ultimately help us to understand how and why people feel that their beliefs are so real? Does it tell us something about where our perceptions of reality come from? And for me, historically, we've primarily, especially when it comes to some of these big philosophical or kind of religious questions, the only way to kind of have an argument about it, and I mean that in a scholarly way, is looking at a sacred text or talking about a belief. If we talk about free will, do we have free will? Well, it's sort of like a philosophical argument. But now here we have some brain scan studies that show that seconds before you make a conscious decision, there's something going on in the brain. So does that mean it is your subconscious or your unconscious, or does that mean we're being controlled? So it doesn't get rid of any of the big philosophical or religious questions, but it adds a new perspective that we never had before. And so it just gives us new pieces of information upon which to now have renewed conversations about this. So now if we're going to have a conversation about free will or about prayer or whatever, there's also this other piece to it. So I think that's part of it. And of course, maybe the last answer to your question too is that there are people who have all different perspectives. So there are certainly people who are deeply religious who say, I don't really care what's going on in my brain. I'm religious because I'm religious, and that's fine. But there are other people who are very appreciative of understanding, oh, okay, it feels real to me. It has meaning for me. Here's a brain scan that shows that my brain is changing. That makes sense. Now I get it. Now I understand even more why it's valuable to me and how it has an influence on me and an impact on my behaviors, my emotions, the things that my job, my relationships, and things like that. So I think it does depend to a certain extent on how anyone wants to look at these particular questions. But to me, it just gives us this new piece of information that we've never had before that just adds to the richness of these conversations and these debates. And that's, to me, also what makes it kind of fun to really have more of those abilities to have those discussions and have this new, it kind of integrates the scientific piece of it with all of the philosophical and the theological.
Nice, thank you. That was a good explanation of how these relate to real life, maybe to some degree. So I want to ask my next question, which is about your recent book, which has a very interesting title, Sex, God, and Brain.
Right.
So do you want to tell us a little bit about what this book is about?
Sure. Well, so first of all, starting with the last discussion that we had, that this, in no way really has any diminishment on religion or spirituality, but how do we understand this overall relationship? And so it really kind of stems back about 30 years to when I first started doing my own research in this field. I had a mentor who by training was an MD. He was a psychiatrist, but he also had a PhD in anthropology. And so he was very interested in kind of this anthropological perspective of things. So if you take an evolutionary look at this discussion, the other thing that he was very interested in the context of religious practices were religious rituals. So he felt that rituals were a fundamental part of every religious tradition, which I think they are. And of course, rituals can include prayer practices, meditation, ceremonies, holidays, all of these, any ritualistic, rhythmic kind of practice that one does. And by rhythmicity, it can be within the practice. It can be, rhythmic in the sense of we do it every year, rhythmic in the sense that we do it with every generation. I mean, so there's all these different rhythmic elements of it, that rituals are kind of this fundamental part of religious and spiritual traditions. And actually, rituals are kind of a fundamental part of humanity. I mean, we have rituals in sports, we have rituals in politics, we have rituals in, just waking up rituals. So everybody has them, and they kind of connect us to ourselves, they connect us to the world. But then the question is, well, where do these rituals come from? And so if we think about the brain, and if we take, again, an evolutionary perspective, we would say that, well, arguably, if the human brain evolved from animal brains, then human rituals should have evolved from animal rituals. And so do animals have rituals? Yeah, I mean, actually, and he wrote a book many years ago, back in the 1970s, called The Spectrum of Ritual, where he looked at rituals in a whole variety of different animal species, from birds to primates and so forth. And he said, gee, the animal world is loaded with rituals, but the one common theme of all animal rituals is that they are all mating rituals. So if that's the case, then if human rituals evolved from the mating rituals of animals, then there should be a connection between mating or sexuality and rituals. And so when you start to think about this from a biological perspective, there actually are some amazing connections and just, to not go into too much detail, but I think one of the most basic ones is that we have, in addition to our brain, we have the autonomic nervous system, which kind of connects the brain to our body. And the autonomic nervous system has an arousal side, the sympathetic nervous system. It has a calming side, the parasympathetic nervous system. And these different rhythms and rituals can drive either one of those systems. So if you get involved in, very frenzied Sufi dancing or something like that, then you kind of activate the arousal system. It's a highly energetic experience. And so you can have that kind of experience, or you can be deep in prayer and, rhythmic prayer over and over again, where you develop this very profound calmness and blissfulness. But interestingly, at some point, the other side can kind of kick in. And there's a lot of interesting evidence for this, that in the midst of this incredible arousing and frenzied activity, you feel this powerful sense of blissfulness and calmness come over you, or in the midst of this calmness, you feel this incredible sense of arousal and energy come over you. So we know that there's these complex interrelationships between the autonomic nervous system when it comes to these ritualistic practices. When it comes to spiritual experiences, again, people can have this interesting range of very blissful to very arousing and to the combination of the two. And it is the combination of the two that tend to be in some of the most intense kinds of spiritual experiences, where, you know, basically called mystical experiences, these kind of ecstatic enlightenment, you know, different words that people use. But interestingly, if you look at mating and sexuality, those rituals are using the same systems, and you have the sense of arousal. It ultimately, the rhythms and all the different elements that are part of mating kind of come together to create a very, very powerful experience that actually uses both arms of the autonomic nervous system. So there's a lot of interconnection there. And maybe the last thing to say, again, I go into a lot of detail about this in the book, but that kind of the basic aspect of all rituals are kind of two main things. One is to identify. So in the mating process, you want to identify a mate. In a ritual process, you want to identify the group that you're connected to. And so by doing certain practices, by doing certain, you know, eating certain foods, saying certain prayers, that identify, hey, this person is part of my tradition, is part of my group. Just like in the mating rituals, you're connecting with, you know, another animal. And so part of it is identification. And then the other part of it is making the actual connection. And that also is a very, very powerful part of, you know, virtually all rituals. In the context of mating, it's bringing two individuals together. In the context of religious or spiritual rituals, it's bringing people together. It could be two people, but it could be an entire group. Everyone goes to the mosque to pray. It connects all of, you know, each person is doing it individually, but it also connects them all together as part of that process. So it becomes a very powerful way of kind of helping us as a physiological person connect with the spiritual part of ourselves. And that's really what I'm talking about in this book, which is, how does that connection kind of occur? How does it kind of utilize the parts of ourselves which really lead to some of the most powerful kinds of experiences that we have? And that maybe the last thing I'll say here is that, at least, you know, based on everything that I've seen, you know, there isn't some specific part of our brain or some new part of our brain that just suddenly lights up when we do something religious or spiritual. It's using the same parts of our brain. So if we read a sacred text, if we say a prayer, we're using our language areas. We're not using some other part of our brain. And it would very much make sense, I think, for the religious and spiritual to connect to the most powerful kinds of experiences that we can have as human beings. So that's where I think this relationship comes from. And I just talk about that relationship and talk about how that, you know, leads into many other aspects of morality and understanding these very profound experiences that we have.
If I may ask a follow-up question.
Please.
That's a fascinating idea. So I have two questions. One is, like, is there a previous literature that suggests the same type of idea that you're trying to advance? That's the first question. And then second question is, like, you talked about the similarities. Of course, there are similarities in the ritualistic behaviors, could be in mating, could be in more developed or more complicated rituals. How about the differences, especially in a spiritual experience? Like, what you feel in the sexual interaction is that the feeling, the type of phenomenology of it is different.
Right.
How do we explain that difference?
Yeah. So, I mean, to your first question, it does kind of derive from a lot of the work that I had done with my colleague, and we talked a lot about sort of where this all came from and some of the studies looking at things like the autonomic nervous system and other areas of the brain. So it is a progressive development, so to speak, but But it does take a little bit of a new leap, and part of it was based on some new research that we've done, looking at different practices and actually looking at a very interesting practice that uses sexual stimulation as a way of trying to induce a spiritual state, which is something which, you know, goes back thousands of years in some traditions. So that in and of itself is kind of fascinating as well. And but to your other point, I think when we talk about, and we talk about this in the varieties of spiritual experiences as well, and I also wrote a book called How Enlightenment Changes Your Brain, really talking about some of these most intense experiences, that there are certain core elements that are part of the spiritual experiences, some of which are overlapped, which includes that sense of connection that I was talking about, the sense of oneness or unity. Now, again, one of the differences is that in mating, it's a oneness with another person, you know, another being, another animal, you know, another person that is part of the mating process, so that it gets kind of limited to that. In religious and spiritual traditions, it's a sense of oneness, but it could be, you know, with God, with the universe. I mean, it could be it becomes something much bigger. And so, you know, to your point, it sort of takes this very kind of, you know, specific thing and blows it up, and I mean that in a good way, into these incredible experiences that have a much deeper spiritual meaning to the person. It really based on, you know, changes their sense of reality, which is also another part. So the core elements of these very, very intense spiritual experiences are a sense of unity or connectedness, a sense of clarity, that they now have a kind of a new cognitive understanding of the world. They get it. They now see the world in what they consider now to be the right way or the real way. A sense of intensity. That is a similar one, the sense of intensity, because these are still certainly very intense experiences, but they could be intense feelings of love. They could be intense feelings of awe. They could be an intense sensory kind of, you know, the most beautiful vision that they've ever had or whatever. But there's something about it that is just more intense than anything that they've ever had before. The fourth core element is a sense of surrender, which also has a bit of an overlap. I mean, at some point, some of the, you know, like in the mating process, there's a physiological, it kind of takes you over. And now, you know, you're no longer sort of in making the process happen. It kind of takes you along for the ride. And when we've surveyed people who have had all these different spiritual experiences, that is a very, very common element to them. And of course, it's the core of Islam, which is that idea of surrendering oneself to God. And that is, you know, kind of a fundamentally important experience, which again takes it to just a whole other level in the context of something religious. And then the last element is the transformative piece, which is that it really, the spiritual experiences truly transform and change the way you are. So you now see everything through a new way of understanding. You see your relationships, your sense of, you know, who you are, sense of meaning and purpose in the world. Your relationship with God obviously is different. And so there's a very big transformational element, which also has obviously a lot of psychological undertones as well. It can kind of take somebody who was depressed or pessimistic and make them optimistic and give them a different insight into the world, or a different insight into who they are as part of the world. So I think that it's certainly, and this was also true of the original work that I did with my late colleague, Jean de Quilly. It becomes, his term was encephalized. So it's sort of taking these sort of rudimentary processes, which are still very powerful, but then, you know, making them into these extremely important and complex ways in which human beings now understand the world in much deeper, much more cognitive, much more spiritual ways. But some of those basic elements have that similarity.
Okay, awesome. I just had one more thing in here, because it's fascinating to me. Okay, so
hopefully there's thousands of more things.
Yeah, we have a list of questions. I'm a bit concerned about them. Okay, so I know that people would automatically draw some philosophical and theological conclusions from this. One way would be more reductionistic, to say that, okay, then we have sexual mechanisms in us, and so an overreaction of that has been the other rituals. That's I would say a reductionistic way of seeing it. And then another explanation would be that sounds like even in sexual relationships or mating, it's like an altered state of consciousness, something like a self-transcendent experience. And that's why the feeling of self is changed a little, and that's how people feel more connection to the world and are less self-aware and become one. And so it seems that the same thing happens in the mating, and the same thing is happening in the other rituals, and we have this readiness in our psychology to change the feeling of self. So, well, how do you see these two explanations?
Well, I think and it's a really important point that I try, and I have always tried very hard to kind of walk that fine line between understanding that there can be a reductionistic kind of perspective, and I get it, I understand, and certainly there are people who go that direction. One of the things that I always try to make a strong argument for, and about 15 years ago now, I wrote a book called Principles of Neurotheology, and I talk a lot about being careful about the conclusions that we draw, that on one hand, someone may draw a very reductionistic conclusion, other people may draw a very spiritual conclusion. We have to be careful about what at least the data are showing and how we decide to utilize that information. So I think that that it can be, again, it can be helpful for us to look at these different perspectives. It provides us interesting information about things like the self and where is our self in a physiological context. But is there a soul? Is there a spiritual self which goes beyond that? And is that what ultimately becomes part of the spiritual process? So I think, to me, neurotheology really kind of leaves room for both. And I think people just have to always be a little bit cautious about exactly what they say about the answers to these questions. And maybe to kind of flip this answer around a little bit too, which is that part of why I got into all of this was that I had a question about the nature of reality and how we perceive that reality. And so as I was growing up and going through my education, I started with this I thought, well, let me look at the brain. This is how our brain helps us to look at the world. I should study that and learn about that. But there became these philosophical and theological questions that kind of went beyond what science had to say. And so from my point of view, looking at both, I sort of feel like both sides can provide very important information, but both sides have certain limitations. Science is great at seeing the physiology and looking at the causal relationships of a lot of different things, but it doesn't have the ability always to get at the subjective nature of our experiences, the ability to, what is something spiritual? Is there something beyond just the biology of who we are? So science has challenges with that. And then we turn to the philosophical, the spiritual side, the religious side of that, which now talks about that piece, but doesn't always talk about the physiology of it. So I personally think, and this is why I love neurotheology, is that I think that we ultimately need both sides to really address these fundamental questions. And I think that as long as we're kind of careful about how we utilize both of those sides and where we draw our conclusions, that we hopefully will get to some deeper answers by using this kind of combined technique. But I also, even with that, I don't know if it's 50-50, if it's 90-10. I don't know what these answers ultimately look like. To me, again, a really fundamental part of all of neurotheology is asking questions, seeking answers, and then asking new questions, and it's kind of a perpetual process. So I think there's just so much more for us to learn that I hope that we, again, as long as we're careful with what we're looking at and being careful about the conclusions that we may draw at any particular time, we know that they're going to keep changing and keep evolving as we learn more and more.
Okay, thank you so much. I love that. So one of the questions is kind of related, is about experiences such as near-death experiences. And I believe in one of your interviews, I heard that you talk about the research that Sam Parnia does. And at that point, I remember, what I remember from your interview, that you said with the things that we're exploring in that front, it's close that we come to a new paradigm in understanding consciousness, you know, a radically different, maybe a post-materialistic way of understanding consciousness. So I wanted to know an update about that. Where did that type of research go, and what do you feel about that right now?
Sure. So you're talking about research that is involved with near-death experiences. To just put it into a broader context, even, to me, neurotheology has also I also think about it often as kind of a big jigsaw puzzle. So there's a lot of different kinds of experiences for us to think about. And so there are near-death experiences and psychedelic experiences and meditation and prayer experiences, enlightenment. So there's disease states. There's people who have hallucinations and schizophrenia. There's people who have Alzheimer's. I mean, so there's a lot of things for us to look at. But specifically, the interesting thing about near-death experiences is that for those who are not sure about what they are, these are experiences that occur when somebody is physiologically near death, and there's a certain core elements to these experiences that many people share. And they are very powerful experiences. They are transformative experiences. So they meet a lot of the criteria that we were talking about a few moments ago about intensity and clarity and things like that. But one of the key elements of many of these near-death experiences, which kind of separates them a little bit from other experiences, is this out-of-body component. That when the person is in the hospital or whatever, they kind of feel as if they float up to the ceiling and they can kind of look down on what's going on. Sometimes they identify that there are other, there's other people in the room, or the color of the hair of the people who are in the room with them or something like that. And so one of the questions that comes up, of course, is that, can we verify that? Can we try to find a way of objectively verifying whether somebody who has that experience, whether that really is accurate? And so Dr. Samparnia and several other people have thought about trying to do that in a very systematic way, where, if they can kind of go to areas like an emergency bay, a trauma room, a cardiac surgery, where people can potentially die, can they do that and then test people to see if they've had near-death experiences, and if they have, do they have this out-of-body experience, and are there ways of kind of really testing that? So to describe it very simplistically, the idea is that you have like a shelf that's kind of above where the person would be, and then on the opposite side of the shelf that they they have some pictures or something like that. And so they'll have a picture of, I don't know, the Eiffel Tower or whatever, and so now if somebody has a near-death experience and they say, well, did you see anything? And I say, gee, it was strange. I saw a picture of the Eiffel Tower. That you've now verified that they actually, there was no other way that they could have seen that other than if their body actually, if that actually happened. My understanding in terms of the context of the studies is that they have not had a quote unquote hit yet, in the sense of a really a truly provable experience where somebody actually did that, but they are working on it. And my point that you were talking about is that obviously, if this is something that can be verified, it really can change the perspective that we have about consciousness, and that maybe consciousness really can somehow be projected beyond the brain, or exist beyond the brain, or separate from the brain, whatever, however one wants to think about that. So the first is to see if that can happen, and then from there, try to understand what that may mean. But yeah, I mean, these are the kinds of exciting, this is why, to me, neurotheology is a very exciting area, because there's so many different ways of looking at these things. And one of them is this kind of thing that can really change the paradigm upon which we understand our mind and our consciousness.
Okay, awesome.
May I jump in for a quick follow-up again? Usually, I think in many of your studies, or specifically in neurotheology, so what we are seeing about discussion on consciousness is confined in the brain. But is that just because the study interest is in the brain, or kind of from a theoretical perspective, you think that the consciousness is mostly related to the brain and not so much embodied or enacted or so on?
Well, it goes back to my other point about being careful of conclusions. I really don't know. It's an unbelievably fascinating question. There is this fundamental challenge, though, and this is the question I ask all of my students. I say, well, look, if you even let's just start with the brain, and you've got, billions of neurons, you have quadrillions of interconnections, you've got serotonin and dopamine running around, you've got sodium and potassium ions crossing membranes, depolarizations going on. Where in all of that are your thoughts? Where in all of that is your consciousness? And I mean, the real answer is we don't know yet. So, whether or not we will find that answer on a purely scientific perspective, I don't know. So if it's not findable scientifically, then at least, or I should say physiologically, then the implication is, well, maybe the brain is more of a receiver of consciousness, and like a radio is a receiver of the radio waves that are out there. And so consciousness is this kind of universal thing that we can then somehow connect with. And that may be the case too. In a lot of my own work, what I frequently have concluded, at least, at the moment, and I don't feel super strongly about this, is that I sometimes think that this separation of matter, so to speak, the matter of our brain and consciousness, maybe two ways of looking at the same thing. I mean, maybe matter itself is consciousness, and consciousness is kind of matter, and then it depends on what you decide to look at and how you decide to look at it. If you take a brain scan, you're going to find the matter, and you're going to find blood flow or whatever, dopamine. And if you ask people the questions and you engage them on a more conscious level, subjective level, you get that. So I don't know, but the short answer is I don't know. I do know there's lots of people looking for those questions. I think there was some bet that I heard about between a cognitive neuroscientist and a philosopher that, neuroscience would answer consciousness in the next 25 years. And apparently the philosopher won because it certainly hasn't figured that out yet. But so I think that there's, talking about a gap, I mean, there's just so much for us to learn about. But again, one of the things, this is where I think neurotheology has the potential to really contribute to this dialogue, because we can talk about these unusual states of consciousness, and whether it's a near-death experience or a psychedelic experience or a mystical experience. These are alterations in our consciousness, and maybe if we can explore them and understand what's happening with them, both on the phenomenological level as well as the psychological level as well as the biological level, maybe we will understand how they interact with each other. And so I certainly hope that we're able to do that. But to me, that is a possible avenue for neurotheology to explore.
Okay, so next question, a little bit unrelated to the other questions. So when we talk about the differences between the hemispheres of the brain, there is always a very simplistic understanding of it. Nobody approves that. But there is a better case of the differences of the two hemispheres made by Ian McGilchrist. Then he argues that the right brain has this attentional style that is more holistic, and left has more like selective type of attention. Then he builds a case for religion and spirituality, and he believes that like the functioning of right brain is very, very integral and important in religion and spirituality. I wanted to know what you think about it. Have you like looked at his work, and do you think that's a good way of looking at how brain functions or not?
I think it's a helpful perspective to take. In today's cognitive neuroscience, there's a lot of discussion about networks. So they talk about the default mode network and the salience network and things like that. I do think that there are certain distinctions between the left and the right hemispheres. Of course, in all of us who haven't had some surgical excision between the two hemispheres, they operate together anyway. But we have certainly talked about this in the context of our own work. Earlier, we were talking about the concept of unity and the sense of oneness, where we think that may be associated with something going on in the brain, is in the parietal lobe in the back of the brain that takes sensory information and helps us to kind of create a spatial representation of the self. And what's interesting is that there's some evidence that the left hemisphere tends to be a little bit more about the sense of self and how the self differentiates from the rest of the world. So theoretically, if there was a change going on in there, you might lose your sense of self or feel that sense of oneness or unity between yourself and, you know, something else. But on the right side, it's a little bit more about objects in the world. So that could be a little bit, if that area is affected, it's a little bit more about the oneness of things as opposed to the oneness of myself with those things. And of course, you could have both. So, I do think that there is some value in looking at the brain in a lot of different ways. You know, a lot of our research, especially with brain imaging, it'll talk about a structure. The amygdala does this or the frontal lobe does that. But again, it's also always in the context that the entire brain is part of that process. And so I think that, you know, we can always, these are all things that can be explored. And so we can do more research. We've tried to do this a little bit in terms of that laterality. It's challenging because, you know, even though we've done a couple hundred people, they're all doing different practices. So it's a little bit difficult to say, oh, well, if you are doing a Christian-based practice, then you're going to have your right side. And if you do a Muslim-based practice, it's going to, you know, we could do that, but we need to sort of figure out a way of designing a study where they're kind of doing the same things just from two different traditional perspectives, as opposed to, you know, if one person is doing a verbal prayer, you're probably going to activate the left part of the brain. If somebody's doing a more visual prayer, you might activate the right side. But that doesn't mean that, you know, those two different sides of the brain are different spiritually. It's just that the person's doing something verbal versus visual. So, there's a lot of interesting challenges, and this is another part of neurotheology that I get very excited about, which are these kind of methodological issues about how do we start to think about designing our studies? How do we what are the comparison states, the comparison groups? What measures do we want to look at? So there's a lot of interesting challenges when it comes to that as well.
Okay, so I think in terms of timing, we are doing very good. And so we have one more question, and it was about an hour, and I just didn't feel the passage of time. It was like, so. Okay. Okay, so last one is about that spectrum of self-transcendent experiences, which is a very lovely way of talking about self-transcendent experiences. I discuss that all the time with my students in class. And so it starts from mindfulness and similarities with awe experience. Dr. Keltner worked on that awe experiences and that side of the things. And then the mystical experiences, and then flow experiences. And then I heard Dr. John Verwicki put them all together and had a very good, and citing your work on that, but then he added a little bit of phenomenology to that and talked about optimal grip, how that helps our psychology in a phenomenological way have a better grip on reality in terms of knowing how to deal with the world in an implicational way, how to connect in a better way with the functioning, in day-to-day functioning. So wanted to know your opinion, if you have added anything to that or any new insights about it, any new research on that, because I like that spectrum a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the spectrum of those experiences is very important. In many ways, a lot of the elements exist along a continuum. So when we talk about a feeling of unity, as you mentioned, you know, it can be, I feel connected to another person, I feel connected to a group, I feel connected to the universe, I feel connected to God, you know, and everything in between. That sense of intensity, the sense of clarity, all of these things can potentially exist along these. So these are sort of, as we would say, like orthogonal dimensions of these experiences. And which also then gets into, well, you know, where do they all fit? Can you have an experience of great unity, but not so much clarity, or you know, so different aspects. And some people are looking at that too, you know, all the different elements and how they fit and how they help us to understand these different experiences. But I think, and maybe, and this is a really, really important point that that I think you're trying to get at, which is that one of the things that is always kind of an underlying piece to all of this, and which is why I got into neurotheology in the first place, as I said, of trying to answer like these big questions, which to me, the most fundamental big question is what is real? You know, what is the nature of reality, and how do we know that? And so what is fascinating is that as people have more and more intense experiences of these types, especially that sense of unity, for example, and you know, you're using the term grip, that you feel that you have this greater sense of realness. And in fact, we did publish some data based on our survey of these experiences that, you know, as people have these experiences, they describe them as not just real, but as more fundamentally real than our everyday reality experience. And everyone's had this. I mean, everybody understands this because we've all had dreams. And so if you have a dream, no matter how real it feels in the dream, when you wake up, you say, that was a dream. And it kind of gets relegated to an inferior perspective of reality. Now we're in this reality, and this is the real reality. But when people have these mystical experiences, and the more profound they are, the more this is the case, the person really feels that they are touching fundamental reality. It is not just as this everyday reality is to dreams, this mystical spiritual reality is that to the everyday reality. And it's not that the other realities are wrong or bad or whatever, but they just aren't as real. And so when a person has this spiritual sense of reality, this incredible feeling of realness, not only do they feel that it's real and incredibly real when they're having the experience, but that persists, as far as we know, it can persist for the person's lifetime. So, and this also goes back to the near-death experiences and so forth. So all these experiences have this element of them. That to me is quite fascinating. It doesn't mean that they're more real, but it certainly is worthy of looking at, because people are saying this is the only kind of experience, these are the only kinds of experiences where people make that kind of a statement, where they say, that was more real than my everyday reality. That was the most real. I touched fundamental reality, however they define that. And so when that's happening, I think that tells us a lot about the nature of those experiences. And then again, trying to understand the physiological piece to that, what's happening in the brain when something feels that real. Why does it feel real? Why do some things feel real and other things don't feel real? If I were to tell you that this entire time I had a little green man sitting on my shoulder whispering the answers, and I mean, you'd all think I was crazy. Why? You know, what is it about that concept that you say, no, there's no way that that's real? But radiation, you know, ultraviolet light that we can't see, that must be real. Because, you know, so how do we decide what things are real and what things aren't? And especially when it comes to religion, of course, because we have not physically seen God, or at least the large majority of us haven't. And so if we haven't seen something, how do we feel that it's real? And that to me is, again, a very important question. And it spills over into every aspect of our lives. And we look at the political world and social world and morals and so forth. How do we decide what is right and what is wrong, what is real and what is not? So I think that's where this kind of information can ultimately take us. But again, we have to be very careful, but it is fascinating. And I do hope that we are able to kind of think about all of these experiences along these different lines, try to understand them phenomenologically, psychologically, biologically, and then perhaps we will get a little closer at kind of understanding who we are as human beings and how we understand the reality around us.
All right.
Exactly.
Yeah, go ahead. Fantastic.
So
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
Just wanted to say that this sense of realness, it's fascinating, and a big part of it is psychological, I believe. Like, it always reminds me of the movie Life of Pi. At the end of the movie Life of Pi is the
What's the best
question
story?
of like, which story is more real?
Right.
And so, you know, there is like, one is more dreamlike, and that Canadian person, which was a symbol of Western thinking, is like, that dreamlike story is more real. So it's like,
well, and what is interesting is that I mean, it's easier for me to say, well, if the parietal lobe decreases, you know, we might have a feeling of oneness. I don't have any real clue as to what part of our brain helps us to think that something is real. You know, because and how do we even decide which one? Like I said, we see things, and I'm looking at the computer, so I visually see the computer. I feel, you know, I see it as being real. But there's lots of things in this universe that I don't physically see. So, like I said, there's ultraviolet light, and there's photons, and I don't see atoms, and I don't see bacteria. So, why are they real, and other things are not? You know, that's something that we don't really know. And interestingly, you know, a couple of people try to do some studies. You know, they haven't been great studies, but you know, the areas of our brain that become active when we physically see like an automobile are the same areas of our brain when we imagine an automobile. So where is this reality? It's really pretty fascinating.
All right. Thank you so much. That was a fascinating talk. And I think a really humble ending. So as science should do to
Always.
So thank you so much, Dr. Newberg. I really appreciate it. I think it was really helpful for us and for the students and people who watch this. As you might be able to say, the outside for me is now dark, and I'm getting to the night. So I really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Yep. Please stay in touch. Please stay in touch. I'd like to keep having our conversations. These are great.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, you both. I hope you have a great night.